So, I don't think little girls have to grow up too big before they get into the princess idea where they want to be little princesses. And, it's easy in our culture because, you go to a store and people say, hey, little princess, and all that kind of stuff. So girls just dream of one day how cool it would be to be a princess. Now, guys, I don't think they're into that. Like, I don't ever remember thinking like, hey, I want to be a prince someday or something like that. Killing dragons, that's pretty cool. That kind of stuff we'll get into. Being a hero, that's cool. But in our culture, this whole idea of growing up to be a princess and how your life could be so different if you were a princess, our culture helps that. And especially Disney, they help facilitate that fantasy. And the story's similar in pretty much all the situations. There's a heroine who is oppressed in some way, whether it's an evil stepmother or whatever, and then she learns to rise above her situation and do things that she didn't think she could, but now she can. And then guess what? A prince comes to her rescue, and they get married, and that saves her, and life is, happily ever after. One of the most famous princess stories is the story Cinderella. But the original story did not start with Disney. It actually goes back to 1st century BC with Greece, with Rhodopis, I think is how you pronounce her name. It's the story goes like this. So the young maiden had shoes, and an eagle comes down and steals one of her shoes. And the eagle flies off and drops the shoe, and it lands in the lap of an Egyptian king. And he takes it as a sign from the gods and says, oh, I must go find this maiden. So he sends out on this quest to find her. Then there's Yishan, and her fairy tale is a little different. This is the 9th century Chinese fairy tale. And this is where she is granted a wish by these magical bones. Okay, I didn't write this story, that's how it goes, okay? And her desire is to create a gown, because if she makes this beautiful gown, a prince will see her and fall in love with her, and that's how it goes, And in this story, the evil stepmother actually is literally crushed she lives in a stone house, and the house ends up falling on her, and she dies, and that is how she escapes, Then, of course, there's Cinderella. And a lot of us grew up with Cinderella, at least one version of the story. The story of Cinderella, literally, it came from Europe, but there are over 500 versions of the story. The Italians were probably the first one to create it, and in that version, there were 6 evil, ugly stepsisters. That's a lot, it's double the amount. And then the French get a hold of the story, and of course it's the French, and they create what Disney then adopted and adapted to be what we know as Cinderella. And we know the storyline, Young girl, she is orphaned. Her dad dies, but he had already married a countess. And she comes, so they're joining of the families, and she has these 3, and the story depicts it as 3 ugly stepchildren. And Cinderella is what's left of, the other side of the family, and the stepmother treats her harshly. The girls treat her harshly. And so she's oppressed. Fortunately, she has some friends, a couple mice and birds, and, that's helpful. And then the fairy godmother comes to her rescue and makes her this beautiful gown. We got the pumpkin carriage. You know how it goes, right? She goes off to the ball because the prince is having a royal ball. And, of course, the blue Cinderella dress that, just stands out. And then guess what? The glass shoe. And she conveniently leaves the shoe behind, and then he goes and tries to find her, and when he finds her, the shoe fits her, which is, it's pretty funny with this whole shoe thing, right? First of all, they're probably not comfortable, glass shoes, okay? But, what's so weird is, she is so unique. When you think about it, she's so unique that out of all the women in the palace area, right, she is the only one that shoe fits. That's pretty crazy, isn't it? And then you have to ask yourself, if the shoe fit that well, why did it ever fall off, right? But she gets the prince, and the whole idea of the story is if she gets the prince, life will be awesome, right? And you'll live happily ever after. Now, there's many good lessons we learned from the Disney princesses and other princess stories, like, you don't have to know your future spouse too well. Don't worry about it. Just marry him. He's probably good. He looks good, or she looks good, and go for it, must be love, Give up your voice to get a guy. That's okay. It all works out. If a stranger kisses you while you sleep, that is a good thing. Okay, that's sort of creepy, but I don't need to say anything more. True love can come when you kidnap somebody. They call that something else, but, it's not love. If you hate your job, just whistle. So try that tomorrow. Maybe that'll work, And always have mice and birds on hand to make your clothing. That's great, because if you have bird feeder out, a couple pieces of cheese, no more Target, Macy's, whatever, And my all-time favorite, I love this one, is, expect the public to burst into song around you. I just think that's awesome. Wouldn't that be great? You're just walking down and start singing. Everybody just cheers in. It'd be awesome. Welcome back to our series called Storyline, and we've been talking about stories. And it's great to poke fun at the princesses and stuff like that, and and there's some really silly lessons we learn, but there's also really some great lessons, and I think they teach young ladies and young men some really cool things about how to rise above, how to persevere, how to have hope, and be determined. So there's a lot of great stories and lessons that can be learned. But we've been talking about belief barriers. We've been talking about how we have these images in our head, and maybe we were brought up with them. Maybe they were instilled in us through school. Who knows what, okay? Maybe it's the shows you watch, whatever. But we have these barriers, and they keep us there. And for some reason, we don't think we can ever get above that, whatever it is. And it could be financially, it could be educationally, it could be relationally. And we think, well, this is just how it is, because I could never do that. I could never do that, And so we're stuck here. And one of the strongest limits, I think, that are created in our lives, and again, I'm not here to blame anybody, I'm just here to talk about the reality, is when it comes to relationships, and when it comes to this idea of if I marry, or should I marry, or who I marry. It's the idea of what we expect around marriage. A couple of the beliefs we learn from this whole princess stuff and our culture, it affects how we see relationships, it affects how we see the opposite sex, and it affects how we even see marriage. One of these is the one-person myth. And you see these in all the shows anymore, It's like we're taught that somewhere out there's this one person, and I wish some mathematician somewhere would just figure out what are the odds. Like seriously, there's 7 billion people on the planet. What are the odds that you're going to find that one person that's the one for you, But we think this, right? And this myth messes with our story because we think there's one out there, and when we find that one, then life will be well. And so what happens is we start in a little relationship, and whatever you want to call it, dating, see each other. You start in this little relationship, and things start to go well, and instead of learning how to work through it, what we do is we're like, oh, well, this is just the wrong one. I mean, it can't be me, because I'm okay in this relationship, but it must be them, and so the relationship must be wrong. And then we think, hey, again, that concept, we may not say it out loud, but we're thinking in our minds, someday somebody will come when I find the right one and they'll rescue me. My prince or my princess will come and rescue me. And so we're not taught to fix things. We're not taught to work things out. We just think that, hey, I just have the wrong one, so I got to go find the right one. And if my marriage is off, guess what? I found the wrong one. And I didn't think it was the wrong one at the time, but it must have been the wrong one, right? The second is this, that with marriage will lead to happily ever after. That somehow, if I just get married, that'll fix it. And so if you're trapped, maybe, you're still living at home and mom's a little, overbearing, dad's a little protective, whatever. And you just think, it's just a bad situation. I just want to get out of here. So maybe at 16 years old, you're like, you know what? I'll just get married because that will fix it, And then if you get married and it's not really fixing it, so you think, I have a kid or two because that'll definitely fix it, no problems happen there, And so we come up with this idea that marriage will fix things. There are many versions of the Cinderella story. I mean, it's all permeates throughout our culture. I mean, one of the favorite ones we like, my wife and I, is the one Ever After with Drew Barrymore. I mean, that's a great rendition of the story. But you see it in other stories. Come on, there's so many Disney stories alone of Cinderella. And then you have stories like Cinderfella. I don't know if you ever heard of that one. I loved that one as a kid. That was a Jerry Lewis. And so it's the opposite. It's the guy who's, gets a nice suit. It's a pretty cool suit, But anyway, it's a flip story. But you have other stories that have that Cinderella theme. I mean, Pretty Woman was the Cinderella theme. It was. Now, I know at the end he didn't propose to her, but, they sort of made that up in Runaway Bride, so we're okay there. But so marriage, what happens is marriage becomes the goal. It becomes an end. And it culminates in this big day, this big event. the wedding day, right? And it's the ball, and you got the dress, and you got the shoes, and you got the the crowds and the fancy food. Now, don't get me wrong, I love weddings. I absolutely love weddings. I love being in them. I love seeing our kids. We got 2 kids that have got married. It's just I love them. I think they're awesome. But we think, if we have this, if that's good, then everything will be fine. And so much preparation goes into a day, including thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, but we don't spend a lot of time in the day after. Well, the honeymoon yet, but the day after that, okay? We don't spend a lot of time. So a lot of couples don't prepare for their marriage, they prepare for their wedding day. And then we wonder why 50% of marriages end in divorce, And for a lot, they're over, they're just not officially over yet. And we've gotten to a point where it's not till death do us part, it's until I'm not happy and then we'll part, okay? The first Cinderella story, though, was not the Chinese, it was not the Greece, at least I don't think it was. I think it actually started with a young woman who was trapped, typical story, and a prince comes to rescue her. And it happens not in the French story, not from Europe, but it happens in about 1000 BC. Now, in our story, where we've been going through with this storyline is we've been going through a little bit of Israel's history. And at this point, where we left off last week, was Goliath is dead, okay? The giant is dead. And that's a pretty cool story. And if, David, who just had a different perspective on life, he wasn't trapped by what all the other men saw. You see, all the other men on the field, you know the story probably. If not, you just go listen to online and we'll talk about it. But the men were afraid to go face Goliath. And David, because they thought they would die. They thought that's how the story was going to go. They were going to die. The army would come in and attack them. And David went there. He had a different story. He knew God writes our story. And God was going to be victorious. So David goes into the valley. He defeats Goliath. After he does that, David's fame rises like crazy. And Saul puts him in charge of armies now. And so they go off to do battle, and and then when they come back from war, the ladies sing songs, and they're great songs. And the new song goes like this: basically, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. Okay, so David's this mighty warrior, a mighty leader, and guess what? The king gets jealous. The king decides, hey, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to give my daughter to him because she's a pain in the neck kind of thing anyway. So let me just give him to David because that'll be a snare to him. Literally, that's what it says. I'm going to give my daughter because it'll be a snare to David. Now, he had promised that to whoever killed Goliath, but he waited on his promise. But anyway, so he gives the daughter into marriage. They get married. But what happens is the king continues to get jealous and jealous and jealous of David and his rise to fame. And then David gets very suspicious that Saul's out to kill him. Now, nobody believes it, but David's like, no, he tried to kill me. You don't understand. So David runs away. When he runs away, there's this obviously big tension between Saul and David. And David's wife now that was given to him is literally now taken away and given to another man. David's out there on his own. He's running away. And the towns around David, wherever David goes, learn that you don't harbor David. He's a fugitive from the king. And what has happened is the kingdom becomes very divided because some believe Saul that, oh yeah, that David, he was rising too fast and now he wants to be king and how dare him take over the throne. And others are like, no, we know David. David's like man after God's own heart. This is a great guy. And we know it's Saul and Saul's evil. And you start to see that. So as David would go into a town, he went to this one town called Nob, where literally the sword of Goliath was stored. So David's running with some men because some men are following him, following with him. They're his men, and they're like, hey, we'll run with you. And so they come to this town, and they give him food. They take care of him. The priest and Nob say, hey, we got the sword of Goliath. You want it? He's like, yeah, that'd be cool. That's awesome. We need everything we can get. So David takes the sword. They leave, and then Saul finds out about this. And so he sends his men to the town. And Saul doesn't have the guts himself, but he gets one of his men to literally kill all the priests of Nob, 85 priests in all. And then he wasn't satisfied there. He then literally wipes out the entire town, men, women, children, even the livestock. Saul's an evil. I mean, he's just evil. And he's rising in his evilness because he's obsessed with finding David. David flees into the wilderness, and he's trying to survive, him and his men. And as he's doing this, the conspiracy continues to rise. David's out to get Saul. He's out to kill him. Well, God does something amazing. And In the one instance, David and his men are hidden up in the caves, okay? And Saul and his armies are coming through, right? And Saul goes up to the cave to go to the bathroom, okay? And that's literally what Scripture says, right? He goes up to relieve himself. And guess what? David's in the cave. And like, oh my goodness. Like, Saul just walked in. Like, how cool is this, right? So David literally sneaks up to him while he's going to the bathroom, okay? And he cuts off a little part of his garment. And then Saul leaves. Saul leaves, goes back down to his army, and then David comes out with his men. He's like, hey, Saul. He's like, God delivered you into my hands, but guess what? I didn't kill you. I'm not trying to kill you. Please, like, stop this, right? And so, Saul's like, oh, I'm sorry, David. You're such an honorable guy. And he's just, Anyway, so David flees. He gets away. But Saul comes right back, starts attacking him again and trying to chase him down. Then another instance happens where Saul and his army, they're all in a camp, right? And God puts this deep sleep over the whole camp. And while they're in the camp, David then this is our opportunity. So David goes in again. And he takes, right next to Saul's head, he takes his spear and he takes his water jug and he walks out. Then they go up on the cliff. God lets them wake up. They wake up and David yells down, hey, Saul, God does it again. God has delivered you into my hands and I refuse to touch God's anointed. You're the king. I'm not trying to kill you. And you have to understand that, like during this time, so the tension's rising because these army men are looking at this saying, Saul, you keep telling us that David's trying to kill you, and every time he gets a chance, he's not trying to kill you. So David begins to get more and more rallying to his side, okay? Now, sandwiched between these two amazing events where God not only delivers his enemy, okay, but David spares Saul's life is this event. And it starts out like this. A certain man in Moab who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats, 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. Now listen to how she's described, okay? She was an intelligent and beautiful woman. So she got both going for her, okay? But not everything was good in life. But her husband was surly and mean in his dealings. So that's a bad guy. And guess what? Probably not a really good marriage, okay? Now, she could have chosen bad. Maybe she was running away from home. Who knows the story? Most likely it was arranged marriage. She's stuck in this marriage. And this is how Abigail could have saw her life. Like, this is it. Like, I'm stuck. I mean, divorce wasn't even options back then. It was like, this is no use, There's nothing will change. It'll never get better. This is how it is. And this is her storyline. She's stuck in it. You see, marriage is not an event. It's not a fairy tale. When you're in a marriage, things change. People change. And sometimes it's not always for the best. And we have to learn how to navigate through that, not escape it. That's why I'm so emphatic on, when couples come and say, hey, we like to get married. And I say, okay, well, here's the scoop. This is what I'm going to do. You're going to spend thousands and a lot of hours, planning your day. I want to work on the marriage, okay? So let's do some counseling, and here's how I lay it out. Because you want to prepare stuff for after, because that's so important. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of couples say, yeah, that's nice, but we're not going to worry about that. And, it's not easy. Marriage is not easy work. You got to work at it. Now, David's nearby. Here's what's happening. And he sends word to Nabal. And that's what he says to him. He says, long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours. You see, David and his men, what they do is because they're living in the wilderness, they're trying to just get by. What they do is they entered into basically a security unit. And they're protecting the local farmers from bandits that come around, okay? So they're like the Magnificent Seven, okay? They're like, the Three Amigos against El Guapo, okay? They're in there to protect them, and they watch over the farmers. And so usually the farmers are grateful. At shearing time, when the animals go to get sheared, or, the harvest time, basically what they would do is go down and say, hey, we've been protecting your crops and all that kind of stuff, protecting your livestock, so we just like to get paid for that. Is that okay? I mean, you can look at it as like extortion, but it's like no, it was more like, look, we're out here, we're going to protect you, and isn't that worth something to you? Okay, so that's what he's doing to Nabal. So he's sending word, he's asking a simple request, and this is what he says. He says, please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them. Okay, so we just want, is there some kind of payback? We're simply asking pay, that's it. Right? We've watched over, we've protected your livestock, we've protected your property, we've literally protected your wealth. You are where you are right now because we've been here. So can we get a little fair trade back, right? Now listen to Nabal's response, because it's interesting. Nabal answered David. He said this, who is this David? And who is this son of Jesse? Now, Nabal knew who David was. Everybody know who David is, okay? David killed Goliath. David has now slain his tens of thousands. Everybody knew. What you see here is Nabal has taken the side of Saul. This is a political thing. He's like, we're on Saul's side. I don't know you, David. Okay? In his mind, you are just a rebel. You are trying to steal the throne, and I don't accept that, And people were choosing sides. Nabal chose the one side, Saul, and others were choosing the side of David. And then Nabal goes on this tirade. He just like blasts into these guys. Basically, how dare you follow David? And all that kind of stuff goes on, right? And then David's men go back, right, to David. Now, how would you respond, right? You just want to provide for yourself, for your men, but you've been wronged. So how would you respond? So this is what David said to his men. Mount up, right? I mean, it's basically what he's saying. Each of you strap on your sword. So they did, and David strapped on his as well. And about 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. Okay, so this is a little bit more than a Magnificent Seven or something, okay? This is 400, okay? He has 600 men at his disposal. And here he is, David's ticked. He's like, what do you mean you're not going to give us anything? Okay, we've been doing this for how long and you're not going to give us anything? Okay, and this is what he's thinking. It actually says it. The scripture actually reveals it. It says this. He says, it's been useless. He says, all my watching over this fellow's property in the wilderness so that nothing of his was missing, and he has paid me back evil for good. I've worked hard. It's time for to be paid back, and this is what he's going to give me. Then he makes this vow. Listen to this. He said, may God deal with David ever so severely if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him. Now, it's never good to speak yourself in third person, okay? That's just weird, okay? But here he is. He's making this vow. He's basically saying, I'm going to kill everybody. And it's like, you're like, whoa, wait a second. This is David? This is a man after God's own heart? He was wronged, right? And he wants to push back. His pride was hurt. And what happens when our pride gets hurt, right? Don't we naturally, we push back, right? We send that email back or that text because that's like less confrontational because we don't want to call them and talk to them or whatever, Or we post something on Facebook or, or we gossip to others about the whole situation. We can put that under the guise of spiritual things too because that's easy to do, But here was a defining moment in David's life. He was about to take into his own hands revenge, right? And one decision would have changed his storyline. This would have defined him as a king. Who are you letting write your story? Who's writing your story? One of the servants told Abigail, said, this is Nabal's wife, okay? David sent messengers from the wilderness to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at him. Goes on, yet these men were very good to us. Now, look at how good David's men were, right? He said, they did not mistreat us the whole time we were out in the fields near them. Nothing was missing, okay? Night and day, they were a wall around us the whole time we were herding our sheep near them. Now think it over, they say to her, right? And see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. What's looming? David is about to come. He's going to wipe them out. They're afraid. They're like, we should have never turned this away. These guys are, Whew. Then listen to how they describe Nabal. These are the servants. They say this. He is such a wicked man, no one can talk to him. Look, we can't even, we can't persuade him. He's never going to listen to us. And Abigail could have said, well, what do you expect me to do, right? I mean, it would be a waste of my time. And she could have just gone so inward, and she could have been like, you know what, guys, this is my life. He's a jerk. I don't like him. I hate the fact that I'm married to him. But I'm never going to be able to talk any sense into him. I can't change anything. And that's where she could have gone. That's where she could have let a belief barrier stop her from going any further. And she could have played the victim. It would have been so easy. But she didn't. She acts quickly. She tells her servants, gather supplies, gather food. I want to send you to them. And then she follows them. Now listen to how she did. This is how it's recorded, right? As she came riding her donkey into the mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending toward her, and she met them. Now you got to picture this. Now I don't know if they were on horses or not, but that's how I picture it because I just think that's cool, right? And here come David, 400 men coming down this ravine, and here's this little woman riding her little donkey coming up, right? And you're like, you got to be kidding me, right? And she gets off her donkey. And guess what she says? David, oh my goodness, rescue me from this stupid man. I hate being married. This marriage is like terrible. Why don't you just go kill him and spare all our servants? No, that's not what she says. She could have, right? She could have gone that road. But she didn't. She bows down before David, literally face to the ground. She then disassociates herself from her husband, not from her husband, but from his actions. She's like, and then she takes the blame. I mean, wow, what a wife. And she's like, wow. She's like, you know what? I should have responded differently. David, please forgive me. Had I known that you requested this, I would have sent all this stuff to you. And then she, listen to then how she paints his story, not her story. Listen how he paints his story. She says, please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my Lord, because you fight the Lord's battles, and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. Do you hear what she's picturing in her mind? This is the king. She acknowledges his kingship. She acknowledges his right to the throne, even though she's now politically opposed to her husband. Totally. Okay, you get that, right? And she says, David, look, you're going to still fight enemies. There's going to be enemies that come. But I'm with you. This, David, this is the kind of king I want to follow. This is the kind of king I want you to be. And then she goes on. She wraps up with this saying. She said, when the Lord has fulfilled, okay, so she goes on a little rant about David, right? And when the Lord has fulfilled, my Lord, every good thing he promised concerning him, and he has appointed him ruler over Israel. Again, what is she doing? She's raising his ceiling. She's saying, David, God will do amazing things through you. I see it. We all know it. We know the prophet, the prophet told us great things are going to come from the king, right? I believe in you. I believe in your God. I believe in my God. He will fulfill his promises. And she expands his ceiling beyond the ceiling that he was living under right now. Because in his mind, it was like, this is where it is. This is where it's got to stay. And then she's like, but David, look, I got to speak some truth into you, right? Because this has to be your storyline. And then she goes on, she says, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. You see, David, like Saul, was tempted to take matters into his own hands. And in this moment, he's about to act like Saul. And his storyline, it wouldn't be what we know. It would have changed right there. And David makes this choice. He says, I'm not going to act. I will leave fate in God's hands. That's what I'll do. Why? Because Abigail stepped in there? No, because Abigail stepped up. Abigail could have stepped in there and stopped it and whined and complained about how bad her life is and David come to my rescue and all this stuff. But she didn't. She stepped up. She stepped up to defend her household, to defend her husband, and she stepped up to defend who she saw David to be. And then Abigail wraps up this speech, right? And she says, David, just when all this happens, just remember me. That's all. And David's probably thinking, okay, how am I going to forget this, okay? I mean, it's not every day your 400 men come charging down and there's this woman riding on a donkey and you're like, what is that? It's like, and it's this woman and all she doesn't want to just talk to you, She spoke truth into David when David needed to hear it. She saw that God could not only use David much more than David saw himself in that moment, but she saw that God could use her. It was Paul who wrote this. He said, consequently, he said, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. What keeps us right? What keeps us in the right direction always goes back to the truth. And it always goes back to Jesus. Jesus said, I am the truth, right? It always goes back to Jesus. David let his belief level be lowered of who he thought of himself, who he thought of his God. And in that moment, he thought, you know what? I know better. And my decision is better. And this is going to be the right thing to do. And I'm just going to act on it. And in the middle of these two events, where you saw God so gracious, right? God was gracious to deliver the enemy, saw his enemy right into his hands. And then God allowed David to be so gracious. I mean, this is Saul. He just murdered all this whole town, right? And David's like, I can't touch him. Because that's what God says. You can't touch him. He's the king, right? And in the middle of that, David's willing to take things into his own hands, right? But then David said this to Abigail. Look what he realized. He said this. He said, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. You see, in that moment, Abigail became his savior. God sent her into the valley to remind David of who his God is and what his role in life is going to be. You know, when we read Psalm 23, and if you're not familiar with Psalm 23, it's probably the most popular psalm out there, so, read it when you get home, But it talks about David going through the valley of the shadow of death. And even though he goes through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for God is with me, right? And often we attribute that to David going to fight Goliath, because when we went into that valley of Elah and he stood up against Goliath, he was like, yes, I know my God is with me. But here's the thing. That wasn't David's valley of death. When David went into the valley of Elah to face Goliath, David had a confidence in his God that was amazing. Not in this valley. This valley was about to change his life. And if it were not for Abigail stepping in and being Jesus to him in that moment, things would have been so different for David. See, if we want to grow in our faith, if we really want to mature in our walk with Jesus Christ, we have got to be people of the Word, because we have to know the truth. And we got to be around people who are not just making us feel good, but are willing to challenge us in where we are in life. And then David, he turns to her to bless her. This is what he says. He said, may you be blessed, Abigail, for your good judgment in keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. You see, your story God wants to write. And he wants to break the belief barrier that you have. He wants to break that ceiling so that you can rise above where you think you can only go to. Right where you are. He wants to break hold of the thoughts that you have that keep you down, that say, you know what? It's not going to get better than this. It's just going to get worse. There's no way I can get through this. This is my life. And God wants to break those thoughts. The story's not over yet, though, okay? Listen to what goes on. When Abigail comes back, right? So she goes back after all this, right? She goes to Nabal. And he was in the house holding a banquet like that of a king, okay? He was in high spirits and very drunk. So she waits. Wise woman, right? She waits. Then in the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things, and his heart failed him, and he became like a stone. Now, I don't know if it was the shock or anger, who knows what. But, okay, so here's what happens. And 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. God took care of it. David didn't need to avenge his pride. God came in and took care of the situation, right? Now, don't get the moral of the story wrong, okay? Abigail, in spite of her circumstances, right, she rose above. She protected her husband, right? In spite of his wrong, she would do what was right. She would do what was honorable to God and to her king, not Saul, because that was no longer her king anymore. And she let God write her story. That's what she did. You see, maybe you want to be married. Maybe you're single and you want to be married and you're like, it'd just be so cool because again, we were created with that, that'll solve things. That'll make things better, And maybe you're dating somebody and you know what? They're not where you are spiritually. And it's like, but it'll be okay. It'll be okay. And you're writing your own story. Maybe you're not married, Maybe you tried. And you say, you know what, it'll never work. I'll never be able to do that again. I would never, I gave up on that whole thing. And you're writing your own story. Maybe God has other plans. Maybe you're in a challenging marriage. And you're like, you know what, it would be happier if. And you're writing your own story. You see, happily ever after is more complicated than saying I do. And many of us look at life and we look at other people, and it's so easy to look at someone who's financially successful and say, man, I wish I had that. Or somebody who has a career and you're like, man, I wish I could have the career they have. Or I wish I could have the business they have. Or I wish I could have their physical stature, whatever that is, beauty, strength. I wish I could have that. I wish I could have the spiritual confidence they have. Where you look at a church and you say, man, I look at that church, I would love to be a part of that church, right? And we look at these things around us and say, man, it'd be so neat to do that. Or it'd be so neat to have that. But we don't realize and we're not willing to put in the work to make it happen. Because it's going to take work. You see, David and Abigail, the reason God used them is this is an amazing story. The reason God did that is because they were consistent in their walk with Jesus Christ before Jesus came. They knew their God. They knew their God. And it wasn't that they didn't mess up. It wasn't that they didn't have valleys and stuff like that. But they were consistent over time, and God blessed that. But the story's still not over. David hears about the death of Nabal, and guess what he does? And David sent word to Abigail asking her to become his wife. And there it is. Okay, I know there's no ball. I know there's no glass slipper, glass shoe. But you have a woman who had a very hard life. And now that she's a widow, it was going to get harder. And the prince, the future king, comes in and he rescues her. And how would you respond, right? Quickly, Abigail got on her donkey, like, yes, this is awesome, right? And attended by her 5 female servants. And they went with David's messengers and became his wife. And guess what? They lived happily ever after, right? Eventually, she would come into the palace. Eventually, she would be queen of Israel. But guess what she was walking into? By accepting David's marriage proposal, she was walking into a life of a rebel. One who was being chased by not only the king, but all the armies of Israel. Not a great place to raise a family. Not a great place to live. Her and David would now be outlaws together. Like Bonnie and Clyde on the run, At least in the story that Saul keeps telling. Her road would not be easy. It may be hard being single. And you're like, it'd just be so much better if I got married. Maybe it's hard being single again, and you're like, it'd be better if I get married, but I don't want to go there. Or maybe you're in a marriage where it's just, I wish I didn't feel trapped. I wish I felt like I could get out. I wish things were different. And we try to write our story. We try to enter in and we try to say, God, I know what you say, and it's probably good and all that stuff, but I'm going to write my own little story over here. And it'll be okay. And God's saying, would you please just let me write your story? Let me write it. Because what I have in store for you is so much better. It's always better when God writes it. Father, thank you so much for this event that we get to walk into of David and Abigail. What an amazing story. And maybe it's not what spurred the original Cinderella story, but Lord, what a great story of how when we are obedient to you and we are faithful to you, that Lord, you do the unexpected. So Lord, I don't think there's one person here sitting or listening or watching online that our ideas, our concept of marriage and romance and all that have not been tainted in some way by our culture. And we've created these things in our mind about how things are supposed to be, or how they're all supposed to work out, or how much life would be better if only. And they messed with us. So Lord, I'm asking you today to break this barrier, whatever that is. Maybe we're under that one myth that we think there's one person out there for us, and so instead of trying to become the one person and becoming right for the person that we're connected to or that we will be connected to in the future, we just keep searching for that one and searching for that one. Or maybe we think that marriage will make us happy, and because we're not, we can't be as happy. Or because we are, this should be happy and we're not. And man, Lord, we got so much mess in our minds. So Lord, help us to continue to discover what you expect when it comes to relationships, marriage, and the whole stuff. And breakthrough for us, so we can break that ceiling, we can break out of patterns and beliefs that we have had maybe since the time we were little kids. And we're asking you, God, to write our story, not us. And we ask this through Jesus Christ. Amen.